Friends who frequently see wolf packs in the wild know to stay calm and grab their camera to capture the rare moment. This is incredibly rare footage. Even if you're an experienced hunter, don't try to hunt them. Wolves are more adept than you. Alone, you might stand a chance, but against a pack, it's wise to back off. If you're fortunate, they'll eventually leave. If they don't, you'll need a spear for defense and hope it deters them. Even though surviving in the wild is risky, there's plenty of food around. In winter, just break a hole in the ice. Fishing here for a bit is quite relaxing, and catching fish is effortless. You might think he's just toying with the fish, but check out this one that's bigger than an arm. Who wouldn't be impressed? Who's up for a fishing trip? I promise you'll catch something. Not into fishing? Join us for cattle hunting. Spot a lone one. You can take your bow and try your luck. Who knows, you might end up like him, bringing back a load of tasty beef. No seasoning needed, just toss it in the pot and cook. It's the best tasting meat. We're now on day 45 of the challenge. The camera shifts to Roland. She's still sipping on her beef soup. Maybe she's had too much meat lately. My stomach feels off. Roland's scraping out some fat now, hoping it'll help. In fact, there are a lot of things that can be eaten when you eat the cow's head, and the outer layer of skin is torn off, and the meat on the top is edible. It may not taste very good, but as long as it's cut small enough, it can be swallowed, and no resource can be wasted in the wild. Like the nose and lips, you can use it to make a pot of soup and drink it, and if you have the chance, you can make it into a hat and wear it. Roland's life keeps improving. Be very careful when scraping with a knife to keep the fur intact. Scrape gently along the edges. I must admit, there's plenty of good stuff here. Whether for eating, or is it used to maintain items, it is a good choice. It is also good to bake the human bones and meat on it. 100 days challenge for Roland. No longer worries about food. He just needs to keep the shelter warm and avoid injuries. He's sure to win the prize. The others don't stand a chance. Roland just wonders how many contestants are left. I'd love to have them over for some beef. Back in the hunting days, I'd be the tribe's top hunter for sure. Roland seems to be getting a bit arrogant, but I understand. If I hunted a bull, I'd be even more proud. After all this effort, I finally cut out a piece. It should last 3 or 4 days. Once stewed, it'll release a good amount of fat. I could really use that fat right now. I wonder how much meat he has left. The camera cuts to Amos. He woke up in a good mood, planning to gather more firewood, but his spirits sank when he saw the lake had frozen over. His mood plummeted. The fishing rods were frozen solid. How could he catch any fish now? The fish likely wouldn't return to this spot. Amos checked the gill net and found it full of holes. Repairing it would be a hassle, and the odds of catching fish later were slim. It wasn't worth the effort. Amos put the gill net away, struggling to adapt to the cold for the first time. If he didn't have to chop and gather firewood, he'd prefer to relax by the fire in the shelter all day. He noticed many fox tracks on his way. They love to steal food. His own food supplies weren't abundant, so he had to be extra cautious at night. He also saw traces of other animals not far from the shelter. Amos was quite worried about this. If a wolf pack or black bear appeared, the shelter wouldn't hold. He was anxious about what lay ahead. Meanwhile, Kielyn was crafting a gill net, still hopeful for a catch. The key point was that this was his first attempt at making one by hand. Catching some fish would be a bonus. Even though he wanted to set it down now, the area felt risky. He feared that if he went down, he might not make it back up. For now, he had to proceed cautiously. Rabbit fat was too rare. Eating it only made him hungrier. He desperately needed the nutrients from fish. Catching one every few days would help sustain him. Before heading out, he had to build a fire. If he fell in, he could return to dry off and prevent hypothermia. No one could guarantee their safety. Kielyn's idea was good, but the rocks were covered in ice. Walking on it was especially treacherous. Kielyn hesitated for a long time, but ultimately took the risk. If she didn't catch any fish, she might not survive the next few days. She reached the platform and quickly dipped her wing into the water. Suddenly, Kielyn slipped and fell to the ground. It was really awful. Her teeth hit her lip directly. Fortunately, the wound was small enough for Kielyn to treat herself. She now avoids thinking about death and wishes she didn't have to return here. After getting back to the shelter and cleaning the wound, he figured stitches weren't needed, but eating would be tough for a bit. This time, it was just a fall and an injury. If she fell into the water, the crew couldn't rescue her in time. Kielyn was terrified at the thought of falling into the water. She feared it more than hunger and knew she needed a safer fishing spot. Kielyn was growing increasingly anxious. By the 46th day, Amos still had some dried fish to sustain himself. As the temperature kept dropping, it became harder to find more food and to adapt to the cold. He had put on all his clothes, but it wasn't very effective. He wished he could roast himself over the fire. The smoked fish supply in the shelter was running low. Amos needed to ration it, or it would be gone in a day. The smoked fish was incredibly tasty, even in small amounts. Sadly, once it was finished, there wouldn't be any more. He needed to find more food. Suddenly, wolves howled. Amos quickly went out to investigate. The sound seemed to be at a distance. He wasn't sure exactly where, but he was definitely in wolf territory. Amos was quite bold. It was his first time encountering such a situation. The best way to face a wolf pack is not to show fear and retreat. You can only scare them off by confronting them. To stay safe, Amos returned to the shelter to craft weapons. He needed to be prepared to confront the wolves calmly at any time, though he hoped to avoid them if possible. Amos planned to make a spear. After continuous grinding and adjusting, it was gradually taking shape. The decoration wasn't just for looks. The added weight from the decoration made the spear easier to handle. Now, everything was set. It was just a waiting game for the wolves. Let's check in on Roland. She watched the crows in the sky, feeling annoyed because they always tried to steal food. She can only blame herself for having too much meat. Tired of beef every day, Roland plans to catch some fish today. Paired with beef, it would be delicious. Roland heads back to a familiar fishing spot she hasn't visited in a while. She wonders if there are still fish passing by. She quickly goes back to get the gill net and sets it up. Luckily, the rocks here aren't too slippery. For now, she's safe from slipping into the water. As Roland wonders if the gill net will work, she spots a herd of cattle nearby. Wow! If she could hunt another, she might need a shed for the meat. If she could find a lone one, she'd be happy to hunt a few more. She sneaks around to track the herd's direction, hoping they don't run to other contestants. If someone else hunts them, she would be upset not getting any beef. Meanwhile, let's check on Jillian. Today, she's lucky to catch a grouse. It proves that traps are somewhat useful. Although grouse meat is good, the taste is a bit lacking. Her husband's cooking is unbeatable, and she never tires of it. She longs to go home and hug him right now. Life here is truly torturous. She feels she has no chance of lasting 100 days. She's already starting to give up. Soon after eating the grouse, Jillian is hungry again. She goes to the lake, needing fat to sustain her. Right now, only fish can satisfy her. Everything else just makes her hungrier. Plus, the temperature is dropping. Even breathing feels a bit painful now. Jillian plans to try ice fishing, though it's quite risky. If she falls into the water, it won't be just a simple cold. The ice looks a bit thin at the moment. It might take a few more days for it to be strong enough. Jillian wanders around nearby and thinks ice fishing might still be possible. She'll check again tomorrow. She really needs the fish fat. On the 47th day of the challenge, Amos is in decent spirits. Today, he plans to gather more firewood and set up some traps. It's a good plan, but suddenly a wolf appears outside. Amos is on edge, fearing the wolf might attack any second. More wolves are roaming by the shore. Amos doesn't even dare to breathe loudly. The wolves are just circling around. He has no idea what they want. Finally, once the wolves leave, Amos ventures out to check. They are at his fish processing spot. It was extremely dangerous. If he had been sleeping there, the wolves might have barged in for a feast. Now Amos just wants to go home. Being stalked by a wolf pack is terrifying. They were less than 10 meters away. If it had been a lone wolf, he might have been able to hunt a single wolf with his bow and arrow. He prays the pack doesn't return. It's day 48 of the challenge. Jillian notices the weather is much colder and hopes the fox fur is warm enough. He's been missing his husband a lot lately. He desperately wants to leave and return home. Only fellow participants know that loneliness is tougher than hunger. The rabbit has no fat at all. He feels he can't keep eating like this. It's really hard to stay motivated. He could faint at any moment. The fox fur is better than he imagined. He'll try standing on it later. He's talked a lot, so it should be fine. Jillian tapped the ice with a rod, finding it less solid than expected. He hesitated to venture further and chose to wait for safety. Meanwhile, the camera shows Roland arranging fur. He uses smoke to cover the smell, so he can use it for warmth later. His shelter is also very sturdy. The shelter is sturdy and won't collapse under the snow, making it quite comfortable inside. Now, it's time to check the situation at the rock. He's worried about slipping on the rocks. Roland prioritizes safety and doesn't want an injury to force him to quit. Even though a shock cow lasts a while, daily consumption is high. Roland's weight keeps dropping. He could wear himself out. The 100-day challenge isn't for everyone. The environment is extremely harsh. One careless step and you could fall. Roland walks slowly, worried about accidents. Just as he mentioned it, he slipped. Fortunately, it was minor, just some knee pain. However, the net fell into the water. He can't go down to get it. If he waits for the ice to form and then retrieves the net, he might lose it. This affects Roland's mood. To prevent the net from being washed away, he has to risk going down. With a long rod and a loop, he just managed to get the net back. It was tough. Right now, he can't set the net. He'll need to wait for the ice to form before trying to fish again. His knee still aches a bit, so he heads back to the shelter to check on things. On the 49th day of the challenge, Jillian woke up early to find the lake's surface much more solid than the day before. Walking on it was easy, so he could now find a spot to break the ice. Jillian was quite pleased. Fishing was certainly doable. He could almost picture the fish waving at him. He worked on enlarging the hole. Then he could drop the fishing line and wait. Since the water was murky, he had to watch the line's movement. Despite his seemingly weak appearance, he was actually very experienced on the ice. He knew how to survive in cold environments. But he seemed to be struggling, just as Jillian was ready to give up. To his surprise, he caught a fish larger than he had imagined. Overjoyed, he began shouting. He worried the ice might crack, so Jillian lay down to release his emotions. He hadn't been this happy in ages and wanted to share the moment with his husband. This was likely the largest fish he'd ever caught. He felt relieved knowing he had enough food for the next few days and was sure he could catch more fish and rabbits later. Life was finally improving, allowing him more time to fish. Just as he thought that, he caught another one. It seemed winter was Jillian's comfort zone. He was so happy he wanted to jump into the water to cool off. He had to admit, his joy was overwhelming. This was just what he hoped for. He covered the hole with spruce branches and headed back to clean and cook the fish. He couldn't stop smiling. He wondered how many contestants remained and hoped many of them were women, to show they were just as capable as the men, surviving equally well in the wild. He was curious about what would happen next. Let's wait and see together.